Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us as we begin our study of John chapter 2. In our text today, we're going to begin with the recording of a miracle that's near the beginning of the ministry of Jesus. Some people say that this is the first miracle that he performed. Well, it's definitely the first one that we are told about, according to any timeline that you could put together using the four Gospels. But if it truly is the first miracle, we really have no way of knowing. At the end of this gospel, John says in John 21:25, and there are so many other things which Jesus did, which if they were written in detail, I suppose even the world itself could not contain the books that would have to be written. Surprisingly, this gospel account only lists 7 major miracles that Jesus did. And this event, the wedding in Cana, was indeed the first of the 7 that John mentions. Now, on the surface, it kind of seems like an insignificant event. I mean, not the miracle itself, for it indeed is miraculous and something that no mere human can do. In fact, belief in Jesus was strengthened, which is the goal of the Gospel of John. He says, so that you may believe. But instead of a life-threatening sickness or some crippling ailment being taken away, him walking on water, or even flashier things like demons being cast out and the dead being raised, he fixes a catering problem of an unknown family. Well, hopefully this study today will shed some light on this for you, and you can see the significance of not only what happened, but why it happened. To me, this chapter holds a beautiful symmetry. There is a balance that we're going to be able to see. We know that Jesus is 100% God and 100% man. Not half and half, 100% and 100%, as only Jesus can be. And this chapter begins with a scene at a human ceremony, and the chapter will end with a scene at the temple of God, which will have to wait until the next study. But for right now, in John chapter 2, let us begin with the first 5 verses. On the 3rd day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. And both Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does that have to do with us? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Whatever he says to you, do it." John begins here by giving us a timestamp in verse 1. He says, on the 3rd day. Now, normally, I don't sweat the details of that too much, but you're going to notice as we progress through the book of John that most of the time he doesn't care to record what day or what hour an event was. After Jesus rose from the dead, John mentions that it happened on the first day of the week, but he never mentions anything about being buried for 3 days like the other Gospels did. So if John decided that this timestamp was important enough to begin with, we have to consider it. So what is this the 3rd day of? Some people say, well, the 3rd day of the week. And other people say 3 days later from the previous text. Now, while it doesn't appear to be the 3rd day of the week, which would be Tuesday, because Jewish tradition states that weddings for virgin brides were on Wednesdays and widows who got remarried were on Thursdays. But a Jewish wedding was also a week-long event, so it's possible that we could pick up this story here with them running out of wine after several days, falling short on supply one day before the big event. That is possible. But the better explanation is that John meant 3 days after the point where we left off in the last chapter with the calling of Nathaniel. John began his gospel by quoting the opening words of the book of Genesis, and he continues to follow that pattern by giving us details about the first 7 days. Like Genesis covers the first 7 days of the earth and the universe, creation as a whole, John begins with the first 7 days of the public ministry of Jesus, beginning with his baptism. So this is 7 days after the baptism of Jesus, if that interpretation is correct. That also makes sense about it being 3 days after Nathaniel joined them, because Cana is where Nathaniel is from, according to later verses in this gospel. Now, as to whose wedding it was, we're not told. Some people thought it was Nathaniel, but there's no proof of that. Some people say that the gospel writer John got married, but there's no proof of that either. The Mormon Church has this blasphemous teaching that this was the wedding of Jesus, which is contrary to the rest of the Bible. The truth is we have no idea who they are. And the fact that their names are not mentioned tells us that they were not famous people, that the reader would recognize if John were to list the names anyway. And it's likely that they were somehow friends with Mary, the mother of Jesus, because it mentions her being there already. And possibly it could have been a family friend. The town of Sepphoris, where the rock quarry was, about 4 miles from Nazareth, but if you go 4 miles further than that, you come across Cana. So it's not really that far. Verse 2 tells us that Jesus and his disciples, which would be about 6 in number at this time, were also invited. One of the wisest things you can do is always invite Jesus to your wedding. In fact, ask him to stay and be a part of your marriage and in your everyday life. I really appreciate the fact that John took the time to mention this wedding of an unknown couple that were considered insignificant by the people that John expected to read this gospel. If they were important, he would have named them. And I appreciate that because I too am insignificant. I'm not being self-deprecating here. I'm just being honest. I mean, the president of my country doesn't know me by name. Neither does anybody in the local or even state government. No famous musicians, no celebrities know my name. Even though I worked on a movie set and I one time worked on a condominium of a famous player in a country music band, they don't know me. But the fact that someone does know my name, my fears, my worries, and every single detail about me, and that someone is the creator of the universe, that is awesome. The Lord knows more about you than your spouse does, than your parents do, more than the FBI agent that is assigned to spy on you. Okay, I'm kidding, maybe. We may not know who the groom and the bride were, but Jesus did. He took the time to attend something that was personal to them, which shows me he is a personal Savior. This might have been a culture shock to the disciples who had previously followed John the Baptist, because John the Baptist was strictly business. He didn't get involved in anything social. In fact, the only time he did get involved in politics and relationships is when he confronted Herod over his incest and adultery, which got him arrested and eventually killed. But here is Jesus, already limited to only a 3-year ministry to teach and prepare a group of disciples to become apostles, to build the foundation for the future church, and for him to atone for the sins of humanity. He has so much to do in a short time, but he takes time to be present at this wedding. In fact, most of the miracles that Jesus performed in all of the Gospels were during an interruption of him trying to get somewhere or trying to teach something. This shows us that not only does the Lord value all people, he also places high value on marriage. By doing his first miracle here, Jesus sanctified the institution of marriage and the ceremony itself. Now I know that as time changes, our society has tried to remove God from everything. Many people may not know that the words that were spoken at weddings used to mention this miracle that we're reading about right here. It was in the Book of Common Prayer, which was used starting in 1928. And I'll just share with you the first half of it in the interest of time. But you may recognize the opening line. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here together in the sight of God, in the face of this company, to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony. Most people know that line, but it continues to say, which is an honorable estate, an institute by God, signifying unto us this mystical union between Christ and his church, which holy estate Christ adorned and beautified with his presence and first miracle that he wrought in Cana of Galilee. If only that couple at that wedding knew how famous their wedding would become, that we would be talking about it in a Bible study 2,000 years later, that people would use an example of what happened at their wedding in the middle of their own wedding vows. I mean, that is fantastic. Of course, at that moment, they knew that something was about to make the news, but it was not going to be for a good reason. They were expecting bad publicity to come because they had a problem. This problem was very serious for that culture. They had run out of wine. Now, in our modern point of view, and we live in a different culture. We don't see what the big deal is. So you've got to drink water now. Big deal. But to them, it is a social disaster, and it's also a legal disaster. The host was expected to have more than enough to sustain all of the guests for a week-long ceremony. That includes food and drink. A wedding was more than just a union between a man and a woman. To them, it was a celebration and a social statement. The host was expected to almost spend himself into poverty, putting on this once-in-a-lifetime event. Marriage didn't have the cheapened image that modern times have twisted it into. There were no weekend parties in Las Vegas, no eloping at the county courthouse with 2 witnesses. This was big. And the reason they ran out so quickly isn't told to us either. Now, I highly doubt it's because Jesus and his disciples were an added burden. It's likely that the entire village was invited. It could be poor planning on their part, or maybe they just couldn't afford as much wine as was needed. Either way, though, this would have been a social disaster for the couple. They would be talked about for many years. There goes that couple that run out of wine. And I know that sounds ridiculous to us, but that was a big thing to those people. There are a lot of things in our culture that other people would find, amusing or just flat out silly. And it was said that there were legal ramifications if they didn't provide their guests with the expected level of hospitality. That's right, you can get sued. Now, I know we don't understand why it's so important to that culture, but maybe it helps us if we understand that they were in a state of panic. So in verse 3, Mary told Jesus what the problem was. They have no wine. The fact that Mary knew before the guest knew tells me that maybe she was helping with the preparations. That kind of backs up the idea of her being a friend of the couple. Now, his response to his mother also seems odd to our day and time. But since Jesus never sinned, you must not take what he said as disrespectful to his mother. He said in verse 4, "Woman, what does that have to do with us? My hour has not yet come." Now, if I ever spoke to my mother by calling her woman, you would be listening to a different Bible teacher right now, because I would probably be in the presence of the Lord. In fact, I don't suggest that husbands try calling their wives by that title either. I'm not responsible for any injuries that might occur if you do. Again, this is a huge difference in our cultures. The word that he used here and the way that he used it really has no definite meaning in English. That's why it is written down as women in our translations. The closest thing we have to the intended meaning of that word is lady. That title isn't being disrespectful, and we know that he loved Mary. In fact, he used that same title as he hung upon the cross, making the final of his 7 statements to ensure that John would care for her once he was gone. He says, "Woman, behold your son. Son, behold your mother." It was a term of endearment. It was not rude in that culture for him to call her woman, but neither was it a normal way for a son to address his mother either. So there was a shift going on here. Jesus wanted to emphasize that there was now a different relationship between him and her. He was not being disrespectful by any means. After all, most people believe that her husband Joseph had perished quite some time ago. The last time we saw Joseph mentioned in Scripture was when Jesus was 12 years old. That time they accidentally left him at the temple by mistake. If indeed Joseph passed early, because likely being a much older man when they married, makes sense that Jesus, being the older son, would ensure that Mary was taken care of until he was 30 years old and would enter his public ministry. By this point, Jesus' half-brothers and half-sisters were old enough to take that job now of supporting Mary. Jesus was never disrespectful to his family, but he came to this earth for more than just living a normal family life. She was told before he was born that he would be the cause of the rise and fall of many. And I think it was Gabriel, or it might have been the people of the temple, that told her, "A sword will pierce your own soul." She was entrusted and honored to give birth to the Messiah, something that most Jewish women dreamed about. But Jesus always belonged to God first. When they realized that, when he was left behind at the temple and he was 12, where did they find him? in the temple. What did he say as they started to chastise him about falling behind? Did you not know that I must be about my Father's business? She was still his mother. He still loved her, but it's time for that relationship to change from mother to son to a new one, which is mother to Savior. He is the Son of God now. He is incarnate. He existed long before Mary gave birth to him, and his purpose was now on doing his Father's work. But Mary gives us an important pattern to follow. Once she realized there was a problem, the first thing she did, took it to Jesus. She didn't try to solve it on her own. That would usually end up making a bigger mess of things. It does in my case. She went straight to the Lord. And notice that he never said he was going to fix the situation. He never confirmed that he was going to take action. He had just told her that his hour had not yet come. The people, they still had this mixed up theory of what Messiah was supposed to be and what he was supposed to do. It was not yet time for him to be revealed and cause a big stir. During some of his earliest miracles in the other Gospels, he would command the people that he healed to go and tell no one. It's not time. It was still early, and these disciples are not yet equipped and ready to handle the opposition that would come with the Pharisees, the scribes, and the other religious elite. The disciples weren't ready yet for the crowds to press in on them everywhere that they went. But Mary presented her problem to Jesus, and she walked away with confidence that he would handle it. And as she walked away, she was probably even smiling as she told these servants, whatever he says to you, you do it. And by the way, that's also good advice for us on both parts. Whatever he tells us to do, we should obey. And when we ask the Lord to do something, we should walk away confident that he will answer according to his will. As the old timers used to say, pray for rain and start carrying your umbrella with you. Now let's go ahead and get verses 6 through 11. Now there were 6 stone water pots set there for the Jewish custom of purification, containing 20 or 30 gallons each. Jesus said to them, fill the water pots with water. So they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, draw some out now and take it to the head waiter. So they took it to him. When the head waiter tasted the water, which had become wine, and did not know where it came from, but the servants who had drawn the water knew, the head waiter called the bridegroom and said to him, every man serves the good wine first, and when the people have drunk freely, then he serves the poorer wine. But you have kept the good wine until now. This beginning of his signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. We have to be careful here not to skip over the detail of these water pots without giving them a second thought. That would make this really have a less rich meaning if we did. I always try not to major on the minor things unless it's something that's truly remarkable. So I want to back up to verse 6 and look at the details of these things again. These were stone water pots, which were used for purification. Stone. Now don't think of these as clay vases that somebody made on a pottery wheel like some still do to this day. On a side note, I also learned when you're a young kid, you don't use your mom's record player and a bucket of mud to try to make a vase like you see on TV. That form of artistic expression is frowned upon in our household. So instead of being made out of clay on a pottery wheel, these vases were carved out of a single block of solid stone. Can you imagine the labor that it would take to make one of these things? That's why they were used for purification, because stone isn't as prone to contamination like earthenware vessels would be. Stone won't absorb the moisture. It won't absorb any contaminants of any kind. Before the meal, servants would have poured water over the hands of every guest. So a great quantity of water would be needed. Now, if you remember, when we went through the book of Mark, the Pharisees asked Jesus why his disciples didn't ceremonially wash their hands and purify them before eating. And after a good verbal lashing at their legalistic man-made customs, which that was one of, Jesus informed them that what went into your body doesn't defile you nearly as much as what comes out of a man, his words, his sinful actions. So in verse 7, Jesus says, fill the water pots with water. But he had no intention intention of taking everybody in for another ceremonial cleansing. Something bigger was about to happen, and these servants were about to personally take part in this miracle. Jesus could have simply commanded the water to be in the pots, or spoke the command and created wine out of nothing. That would have been easy for him, and it would have been easy for people to explain that away as oversight, like, oh, they forgot that the wine was just there the entire time. So no, these were empty pots that needed filled with water that there would be a lot of witnesses to. 6 pots that held between 20 to 30 gallons. So that's between 120 and 180 gallons of water that they had to bring for every one of them. You know, a single 5-gallon bucket of water weighs over 40 pounds. So there must have been a lot of men carrying all this water. However many there were, they were fully aware that this was indeed water inside these containers. There was no mistaking it. They had hauled it from the water source themselves, and they even had the back pain to show for what they have done. They were witnesses to both what went inside these water pots and what came out of them. In fact, in verses 8 and 9, they were told to carry some of it to the head waiter to try a taste. Now, had it been the disciples that had carried the water and then said that it had turned to wine, that would be another reason for people to disclaim it. Oh, well, you're disciples of this rabbi. Of course you're going to stick to his story. But these were outside people, servants at this wedding right here. Now, they were told to take this water out and take it to the head waiter. Could you imagine what's going through those servants' minds right then as they're carrying this there? Because we aren't told when the change took place. The change could have occurred when the last drop was added to the containers, or did the change happen somewhere along the way to the head waiter? They knew that water went into that jug, and what they were carrying now they thought was still water to be tasted and tested. Verse 9 tells us that the water had become wine at some point before the man tasted it. And it mentions that he didn't know where it came from, but the servants knew. Could you imagine the look of wonder on the faces of these servants when that happened? Just put yourself in their shoes for a minute, and you would feel your heart burning inside you as you realize there is more to this Jesus than I first knew about. And it's a good thing that they had filled these things to the top, as the text said. If they had only half-heartedly put some water in each jug, it still wouldn't be enough to last very long. But thanks to their complete obedience, there is more than they're ever going to need. This has gone from solving a problem that could have haunted that couple for life to even including a wonderful wedding present, as they would no doubt have plenty left over. And that's just the way the Lord works. He blesses us far more than we ask, and definitely more than we have ever deserved. In Ephesians chapter 3, verses 19 and 20, it says, "And to know the love of Christ, which surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled up to all the fullness of God. Now to him who is able to do far more abundantly beyond all that we ask or think, according to the power that works within us." Not only did Jesus turn water into wine, but he did so without adding anything. These jugs were filled to the brim. He made it the best wine that the master of the ceremonies had ever tasted. He was astounded at the quality of the wine, which was unknown to him, and that had just been made by water from Jesus. I would rather be one of the servants who understood what Jesus had done than that man who had no idea where it came from and what happened. I mean, wouldn't you rather be a part of this miracle knowing that it was a miracle? How blessed it is to understand something phenomenal that others will never take the time to appreciate. And we see the perfect example of this every time you leave church. A building full of servants of the living God who have the understanding that God created everything, that he is sovereign over everything, and they see the world that God has made, and they understand that we have a purpose in this world. But to the lost people, they're walking around on a planet that is much younger than their science books tell them that it is. And instead of knowing that it was was fearfully and wonderfully made, they hold to the way of thinking that their ancestors were monkeys, and before that they were just simply amoeba in a pond. A pond and amoeba that somehow managed to come into existence after two asteroids collided. Where those asteroids come from and how space got there for them to collide in is beyond science. How much better is it to know not just how we got here, but to know that our God loves us and cares for us, and to know that there is life beyond this life. There is life beyond death. And like those servants at the wedding, they not only witnessed Jesus do a miracle, they got to participate. And the same way, we also are in God's plan. You are not an accident. You have a purpose. God has given everybody different spiritual gifts, and we are to be using them for His glory. Unlike the master of the ceremonies or head waiter or whatever you want to call him, that clueless guy had no idea what's going on. We, the children of God, servants of God, are in the loop, just like those servants were that day. Now, John chapter 15, verse 15 says, "No longer do I call you slaves, for the slave does not know what the master is doing, but I have called you friends, for all the things I have heard from my Father I have made known to you." It was the servants, not the disciples, who were nearest to the Lord on this occasion. That was an experience for the disciples that began to strengthen the faith that had just recently formed in them. As it said in verse 11, the main purpose of this miracle was to manifest His glory, and it also caused His disciples to believe in Him even more. They had already proclaimed who He is. Some of them had even heard John the Baptist's proclamation, but now they have witnessed His power for themselves. And back to the subject of spiritual gifts. Sometimes believers think that because their spiritual gift is not one of the more glamorous gifts, the other people that serve in the church, they're not in the spotlight, they tend to think that they're less important. Really, nothing could be further than the truth. During the events at this wedding, were those servants glamorous? Did everybody know them like the head waiter? No, but they were closer to God that day. Our God is all-knowing. He sees even the work you do in His name when nobody else is watching. He sees the things that you do for Him that nobody else knows about. But back to verse 10 really quickly. The head waiter exclaimed, "Usually everybody serves the good stuff first, and when people are drunk, then they serve the cheaper stuff." And that makes sense if you think about it, because as people get enough of that stuff in them, their judgment begins to get weaker, and they don't notice that the quality has declined. The head waiter continued to say, "But you have saved the best for last." I'm thinking, buddy, you have no idea. What is coming for the believer is far better than anything that this earth can offer. If you want your best life now, you can go follow Joel Osteen. But the Bible tells me in 1 Corinthians 2:9, "As it is written, things which the eye has not seen and the ear has not heard, and which have not entered the heart of man, all that God has prepared for those who love Him." For the Christian, the best is not now. The best is yet to come, and that will make it so much better that way. I've often told my wife that I'd wished I'd met her many years earlier, and thinking all the times I could have saved myself heartache and disappointment, but she reminds me that having experienced the bad, it makes the good all that much greater. Now for these disciples here that have just started following Jesus, this is just the beginning. As He told Nathaniel in the last chapter, you're going to see far greater things than this. We as believers have that advantage in this life. We know that this life is not all that there is. We know what lies ahead for us, and we can look in Revelation and you know that God wins in the end. But how much sweeter it will be when we get there, because God has saved the best for last. One of my favorite hymns is an old one that's called "Oh, I Want to See Him." Most of the song mentions the struggles that we have here and now while it's looking forward to the future. It mentions things like "Many arrows pierce my soul," and "Dark may be the night," and "Satan's snares vex my soul, turn my thoughts upside." Things that we all experience daily. But in the chorus, you can feel the comfort that the songwriter gets when he looks forward to the time when all of this is over. He says, "Oh, I want to see him, look upon his face, there to sing forever of his saving grace. On the streets of glory, let me lift my voice. Cares all past, home at last, ever to rejoice." When we see him face to face, when all of our worries and struggles are a thing of the past, and there's nothing left to distract us or nothing to cause us to sin and put distance between us and God. When we see him in his fullness and his glory, and when we gather with our loved ones around the throne, then we will get to say those words that the head waiter said so long ago. Truly, you have saved the best for last.